pretty well 4 or 5 days a week. I pick Elise up from the bus, assuming it's one of the weeks that she actually gets to go to school and there's no viruses wreaking havoc on family life. I pick her up from the bus and I always ask her the same question: how was school? And I always get the same answer: it was fine. But occasionally something happens and she wants to tell me a story. And if you've ever listened to a 4-year-old tell you a story, it is a unique experience. A 4-year-old tells a story in a very particular way that they have an idea in their head that they want to convey, but they don't always have the words to make it come across clearly or concisely. And so they tell the story and it tends to ramble and it tends to circle back to where it was and it tends to go back to the same things over and over again until she gets to the punchline where it's hilarious for no reason that's clear to me, but seems pretty clear to her. If you ever listen to the story, though, if you really dig down into what they're telling you, you'll notice that a couple things happen. They don't have a sense of why they're telling the story in this way, but they tend to repeat things that seem important to them. There's something fundamental in the human condition, the way we tell stories. We learn from an early age, even before we figured out the science of storytelling, that repetition matters. That repetition matters. That repetition matters. This is not a 4-year-old conundrum, though. This is something that's baked into us as people, and it's something that's baked into the biblical authors' understanding of how they wanted to convey and tell the stories that mattered to them. The same themes that we look at through the biblical stories emerge over and over and over again, and that's not by accident. The story of Abraham and the child of promise is supposed to be a narrative and supposed to be an idea that we're supposed to carry through with us through the rest of the story. That just as Abraham is delivered with this beautiful story of he and his wife in their old age receiving a child that they didn't think that they could have, so too as we read on through that this idea comes up again and again and again, that somebody who should not be able to have a child is giving birth. And to the point that the story of Mary, the mother of God, becomes the foundational story for how we understand our faith, that nothing is impossible with God because a virgin can conceive and a virgin can give birth. And so the idea of looking for recurrence in the stories that we tell and the stories we read is part and parcel of what it is to be a people informed by Scripture. And one of the stories that's always stood out as one of these strange stories that you hear about in Sunday school and you read about it as a kid and you never really think much about it as an adult is the story of Babel. You know the story if you've spent any time in church, but the people of God after Noah has landed his boat, come out and they're all speaking the same language and they are able to put their singular vision, their singular culture to work. And they decide, I'm going to build a tower all the way to heaven. We are going to work together and we are going to work seamlessly and we're going to build a tower so we can get to heaven so that we can be like God. And God looks at this and says, I know how it goes when people try to live without me. And so God intervenes, and God doesn't crash the tower down. God doesn't rain fire and destruction on it. He simply sows confusion and introduces the idea of language into the biblical story. All of a sudden, people's ability to work together is frustrated by their inability to work together. The dispersal of language becomes part of the story that gets repeated in Pentecost. That just as the tower was going up and people were trying to convince themselves that they could live without God, God steps in and introduces something to frustrate their endeavor. But fast forward 6,000 years later, and as the people are gathered in a room afraid of what is going to happen, wondering how they're supposed to be the people of God in this place, God steps in and frustrates their frustration and gives them the ability to work and to work in a way that spans linguistic barriers and unite themselves around purpose and for conviction and for calling. The act of Pentecost is the breaking of the curse of Babel. The story of Pentecost is the story of undoing what was done at the Tower of Babel. But Pentecost wasn't an original idea. Pentecost was itself a Jewish festival that happened 50 days after Passover. It was about marking the leadership of God through a time of wilderness. And so Pentecost is not, as much as we think about it as a Christian festival, it is at its roots very Jewish. It is at its roots a very Judaic idea that has at its core a story of people wandering and looking for answers. Because the story that Pentecost was supposed to remind people of was that they were called down to go out. The people of God were never intended to simply be a collection of people who held on to the goodness of God in a fixed way that was only supposed to benefit them. The people of God were never supposed to just exist for themselves. In fact, the purpose from the very beginning of the story, the reason that we read these stories over and over again, is because the promise that God gave to Abraham way back at the beginning, before that child of promise, was that the child was going to come so that you could be a blessing to the nations. The promise that God gave to Abraham was that he would be for Abraham and for Abraham's descendants, that he would make Abraham's family as great as the stars in the sky, so that the people who were as vast as the stars in the sky could be a blessing to the nation. That whoever they bless would be blessed by God. The story of Pentecost was about the word coming down so that the word could go out. That is the fundamental story that the writer of Acts, this guy we call Luke, wanted to tell. The other stuff, the stuff before Pentecost, and really the stuff that comes after the preaching in the Areopagus, that's kind of window dressing. But these two stories are the bookends of everything that Luke wanted us to understand about Christian discipleship and mission. That everything that Jesus started was carried through in this way, that the word came down and lived and dwelt as a human being, full of grace and truth, fully God and fully human, so that the word could go out as well. So that the word could resonate with people, so people could hear for the first time in some of their own lives that God had not just a plan for them, but a desire for them. That men and women and people of every size, shape, and stripe mattered to God, mattered to the creator of the universe. The word came down so that the word could go out. And in the story of preaching in the Areopagus of Paul in Athens, proves the promise of Pentecost. That everything that was hoped for in that moment is realized here in this story. That as in the place where ideas were discussed, that in the center of the cultural imagination, in the place where everything that mattered was up for discussion and debate, at this place called Mars Hill, or the Areopagus in some translations. This place where philosophers, where Stoics and Epicureans and Platonists would come together and discuss and debate the big ideas of the time. Paul stands up in the middle of it all and says, let's talk about this thing. Let's talk about what all of this means, because you're debating ideas and I get it, and that's good. I've looked and I've read your thinkers. I've read your philosophers. I've read your people who say in there's something that lives and moves and animates us, and I want to tell you what that is. Because for you as intelligent and thoughtful people, you Athenians, you seem to be really comfortable asking questions and never getting to answers, and that's fine and well and good. But my tradition, the Jewish tradition, is really comfortable with having answers and not asking questions about it. And so here, why don't we come together with this? Why don't we bring this Jewish idea into a Greek world? Why don't we bring this Jewish idea of sitting on the truth and meditating on the truth and begin to interrogate it? Because the reality that all of it comes down to at the end of the day is that something happened on Easter Sunday. Something happened that the Jewish resilience and resistance to interrogation wanted to deal with, couldn't deal with. The Jewish understanding of faith as a fixed tome, of where the writings are collected, and Second Temple rabbinic Judaism had all of the answers, had its systematic theology tied up nicely and tidily in a package that it could understand everything and it could answer every single question that you would ask. Jewish systematic theology said that there were prescribed laws for how you were to eat, how you were to order your life, how you were supposed to be, and in every situation. That when the law says don't boil a goat in its mother's milk, that we understand that this means that you definitely can't consume dairy and meat at the same time. They definitely can't be on the same plate. And in fact, if you have a chicken salad sandwich, here is your prescribed penance for being so atrocious. The Jewish systematic theology was so resistant to interrogation, and the Athenian worldview was so resistant to answers. And so Paul steps into it and says, here, let's bring these two things together. Let's take the best of the Athenian willingness to ask questions and interrogate reality, and let's pair it with the Jewish reality of faithfulness and believing and understanding that something can happen, that things can be understood and rationalized and wrapped around. And when those two things come together, the promise of Pentecost, the promise of the word coming down so that the word could go out, was realized. The church was born on this moment where Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, stood up in a world that didn't know a thing about it and explained the story of Jesus to them in their own language, so that for the first time they could hear it not as a need to become Jewish converts, not as a people who even identified themselves as religious, but as people who saw themselves as looking for answers to questions they didn't even know yet how to ask. These stories are meant to be read together. They parallel each other, and it's not an accident. Both stories are conditioned by their location. One happens in Jerusalem, the center of religious certainty and religious life, the place where the temple sat, where God lived. Both stories were provoked by the Spirit. They weren't about human action of people going somewhere. It was the Spirit came down and people just had to share it. Or in this case, Paul says literally that his spirit was provoked. That both stories result in people wondering what the heck is going on with this. That in one case, in Jerusalem, they're assuming that these disciples are drunk, even though it's 9 a.m. And in the other case, they're wondering, who is this guy that's talking to us about foreign deities? In both cases, though, the story ends at the same place with the explanation and the description of Jesus as the answer to all of it. These stories are meant to be read together. These stories tell these stories bookend the entire work that the church has been doing up to this point. These two stories tell us how to understand the art of incarnation in our world. Because Pentecostal proclamation is all about engaging with the ideas of the moment. There are ideas in the world that need to be engaged with. And the church has tended to either to treat the ideas that the world comes up with either suspicion and revulsion, that, if we tell our kids that they can't read Harry Potter, or that they can't go to see these they can't play these hyper-violent video games, or that they can't do these things, that they can't. We put all of these prohibitions on the things in culture that seem to matter, that seem to create a resonance, and we reject them out of hand because they offend our sensibilities, or they create a troublesome conversation that we're not really sure we know how to have, or we take them and we absorb them whole hog. That we simply say, well, why don't we just put a Christian spin on that? And instead of going trick or treating, we have trunk and treat in the parking lot of a church. That instead of going out and getting candy and meeting your neighbors, you do something at the church instead. And we Christianize and we colonize the ideas of the world with a Christian spin. If you've ever seen there's a whole genre of T-shirts that you can get that proclaim the sanctification of something that instead of it being the Heinz ketchup logo, it would be the I can't think of a good example of that off the top of my head, but I should have. If I'd been more on the ball, I would have had to put a picture of that up there. But the thing that we forget with either of these is that the world is having a discussion outside of the doors of the church, and whether or not we reject their ideas or try to Christianize and colonize their ideas, they're still having the discussion without us. 80% of Canadians do not attend church even once a month. 8 out of 10 of our neighbors will not darken the doors of a church on their own in the next 12 months. And so the reality is that they're still discussing big ideas. They're still discussing the questions of the world around them and the nature of how it all shakes out. They're just not inviting us into the conversation because they think we don't either want to hear it, or we have no interest in it, or we're going to take it over. One of the greatest shows that I will try to recommend to people when they ask, what have I been watching, is I love to recommend the show Breaking Bad to people in the church. Not because it's a show that we should commend. I think we can safely say on a Sunday morning, meth is bad. But Breaking Bad is one of the most interesting shows from a Christian perspective, because it showcases the reality of what does sin really do, what does sin really look like, what does it mean to be a people who say, as our doctrine teaches, that we are fundamentally broken, that we have a sin nature in us that leads us down paths that we don't necessarily want to go. And the show is all about watching a person who you can empathize with at the beginning of the show make bad decision after bad decision, faced with a reality that he doesn't know where he's going. And if you asked him at the beginning of the show if he would be this person by the end of it, he would have said, no, absolutely not. But Breaking Bad showcases how choices matter. It shows us that there are discussions and big ideas that we can have a part in if we don't either dismiss their ideas out of hand or try to absorb them and Christianize them ourselves. Paul understood this. Paul understood this because he took the time and energy not only to read and understand where the Athenians were coming from, but also to read the people that they were reading, to be able to quote back to them their own philosophers, these people who were the rock stars of their time, the big thinkers, the influencers, the people who mattered and whose ideas mattered. Paul quotes them back because Paul has undergone a fundamental shift that I think matters for us today in the church. Paul no longer considers himself a monotheist in the sense that he did before. where his Jewish identity would have said there was one God, and to understand him is to know life in the full. His Jewishness would have held that there was one God, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The only God who was worthy of being God was Yahweh, and that was that. But the more time he spent in the world, the more he looked around and realized that life's too short to pretend you're not religious. That there are many things that we call gods. That there are many ideas that we give top billing to. That there are many things that captivate our attention. And if we understand that God is that to which we ascribe highest value, then every single one of us has a God. Every single one of our neighbors who will never darken the doors of a church has a God, because there is something in them that ascribes ultimate value, to which they ascribe ultimate value. There is something in their life that challenges the way they create a system of values, a system of justice, a system of right and wrong, a system of beliefs. That there is something in their life that they might not call God, but that sure as anything fills that role for them. Paul understands that in order to reach the world, monotheism isn't going to cut it. Simply saying your God doesn't exist isn't going to cut it. Instead, he learns how to say, I see your God. I understand that you are a people who are very religious, that you have lots of gods. In fact, you have so many gods in this place that you set up a temple, an altar to one, and you said, just in case we missed one, we're going to create a temple to an unknown God. We're going to, we want to cover all our bases, and if we want to be really good religious people, we're going to put a coin in all of the offerings, and we're going to put one for an unknown God just in case we missed one. He honors the fact that they're very religious. He honors the fact that says, look, I get it. You want to make sure that your bases are covered. Let me tell you about the God you don't know yet. And let me tell you about the God you don't know yet. And let me show you and tell you and help you understand why the God that you don't know yet is the one who is worthy of more of your adoration, who is worthy of getting the spot of top billing in your life, who is the one that can be that source that can define your sense of values and your sense of justice and your sense of right and wrong, who can tell you the way things should be and the way things could be. He tells them about this Jesus, and he's met with two responses. He's met with some people who say, bah, nothing. And he's met with some people who say, I want to hear more about this. If we want to be monolatrous, which is the big fancy word in our society today, because we live in a pluralistic culture, we live in a society with many different gods. If we want to learn how to be monolatrous, we can mirror what Paul shows us here today. We can be confident without being conceited. We can dig in instead of sitting back. We can interrogate the faith of the historic Christian church. We have a 2,000-year-old faith tradition, and you know what? As you dig into it, it tends to hold up. The big questions, why do bad things happen to good people? You might be wondering that might be an idea that lives rent-free in your head. Or where's God when it hurts? Why does it have to be the way it is right now? All of those questions are not original to you. I love you, but you're not that creative. You're not the first person to think those questions and wonder about those things. Those are things that the church has for 2,000 years wrestled and grappled actively with, and still will beyond when we are long gone. We can dig into the questions of faith. We can be like the Athenians and say, I want to hear more about this justice of God. I want to hear more about this idea of somebody rising from the dead, because that seems bonkers to me. I want to hear more about this idea of a Holy Spirit who can live inside of me and can shape my being from the inside out. I want to hear more about X, or I want to hear more about this or that or the other thing. We can dig in to the faith that we have heard about, because the reality is that it stands up, and the people who tend to walk away from church walk away not because they found something hard, but because they found something, or they didn't want to try something hard, and so they left everything behind. Brendan Manning puts it this way. He says, "The Christian faith has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." And so the challenge for us is this: pay attention to what we pay attention to. What are the questions that the world outside of these doors are asking? Because I bet they're different than the questions that we're asking. When you gather at Betty's for lunch, have your conversations, have your chit chat, and do that, and that's fine. But if you can, take a sip of coffee and try to eavesdrop on what the conversations are at the next table over, because I bet they'll be interesting. I bet they'll be wild, and I bet they'll be wildly different than yours. This is what it takes to reach the world that God has sent us to. Confidence without conceit, a willingness to dig in and interrogate the faith that we have received, and an openness to pay attention to what we pay attention to. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.